Welcome to the Citizens Reporter. I'm your host and editor, Diana Longery. Thank you for tuning in. The Citizens Reporter is a weekly news cablecast coming to you from the Valley Access Studios in Stillwater. Now, to help me with this week's news is one of our regular citizen reporters, Mr. Mark Bradley. Thank you, Mr. Bradley, for being here.
Thank you for having me. And the first thing I'd like to talk about is something that's happening out at the Mall of America. They're going to be adding a new water park. We've been talking about that constantly, and we've been trying to pay attention to it so we are really aware of what's going on. Well, I use a word that's kind of fancy called convoluted. It means confusing, and it is very confusing how they're doing that financing because they're going to a nonprofit and also a group that's going to be doing the actual financing of it in another state.
And what's interesting about this, Mr. Bradley, is that the city of Bloomington, they want to ensure that the financing, however it is done, doesn't impact their credit rating as a city. So for instance, if there's financing that needs a pass-through entity, a governmental entity, the city of Bloomington, while they support that financing, they don't want to be the conduit for the financing because it might have an impact on their credit rating. And so it's my understanding, looking at this article, and this is from the Star Tribune of October 26th, is that the city of Bloomington that the Mall of America and the organization that is looking to put in this water park, they are actually going to be getting their financing through a public development authority in Arizona.
Right.
And that this particular public development authority is one of the few in the country that will actually take on projects and serve as that financial conduit for projects that aren't even in their own state. Now, of course, they don't do this for free. They do it for a fee. And it turns out that the company that is working with this Arizona entity is a nonprofit out of Louisiana. So you've got many different players in this project, and what they also say in this article, which I think is sort of telling to what impact it might have on the consumers that go to the Mall of America, is that it says here that the proposed water park would be one of the largest in the country if it were constructed. The Mall of America proposed the facility, but believes it would not generate enough money to cover private financing costs. So then that brings up the question of how do you secure payment when you've borrowed this money and you've got financing? How do you secure the payments that it won't be that it won't go into default? Well, where the city of Bloomington then comes into this is that they are not on the hook to specifically provide security for the funding, but they are on the hook to say and to agree that in the event that the amounts of revenue do not come in that support the repayment of the financing for this water park, that the city council will raise the sales tax on all the sales that are coming out of the Mall of America to pay for that financing. So they have that part to play in providing that an increase in sales tax will be the security for the repayment of that financial money.
But it is the big issue here happens to be the massive amount of repayment that's going to be done every year. And that's the scary part about it.
Well, in the newspaper article indicated that potentially that the rent that the water park facility would be paying to the Mall of America potentially could be $2 million a year for rent. So what happens for instance, if the water park can't make a go of it, they've got all these, the reconstruction that's been done in the mall, and now the mall owners are left with a facility that's been renovated for a use that now they'll have to re-renovate it for some other use.
Right.
So what's next, Mr. Bradley?
I also have something on here that talks about whistleblowers. And in this case, they're talking about the Department of Human Services. The lawyer there has been questioning some of these contracts if they're appropriate.
Now, this particular article is in the Star Tribune of October 26, DHS, Department of Human Services. The whistleblower is Faye Bernstein, 54. She's an attorney and the lead contract specialist at the DHS. And she said in a recent interview that she had been excluded from key meetings over state contracts. And she's been subjected to threats of termination and targeted with rumors designed to undermine her credibility. And she said that this sustained campaign of retaliation began in mid-July after she raised alarms as the lead contract specialist that certain contracts approved by the agency's Behavioral Health Division, which, by the way, awards millions of dollars each year in contracts to mental health and substance abuse treatment providers, she felt that some of these contracts were not in compliance with what the state regulations are. And she says that it makes her worried that the same mistakes will be made again, and over the long term there will be a misuse of taxpayer dollars. And it says here that she alleged that DHS employees skirted the rules in awarding contracts to organizations, and that some managers failed to report contract violations as they are required to do so by law, and that some employees had possible conflicts of interest. And so in August, she filed a formal complaint against 8 supervisors, managers, and employees at the DHS. So thank you, Mr. Bradley, for bringing that forward, because whistleblowers within an organization can play a very important role in making sure that there's accountability within the organization with regard to the laws and policies and procedures that are in place to protect the taxpayer. So what's next, Mr. Bradley?
Well, basically, I think I've pretty well covered the side that I was going to today, because I think we've got to take a look at what's going on with the city at this point.
Well, we've got a number of things that we want to follow up on. Certainly on a previous news program, we have gone in length and reported on the new rental licensure program that Maplewood is going to be putting into place. They've passed the ordinance now, to the objection of many, many, many people in the community, both landlords and tenants alike, because not all tenants are supportive of the new ordinance.
Right.
Because this new ordinance also does have some unintended consequences for tenants. Namely, it will certainly result in increased rents for tenants who are not so able to afford the rents they have now, and this is pretty much a guarantee that they will have an increase in rent. So we are going to cover today, though, some of that discussion and where it now leads to with that program in the way of inspections. And so we've got film footage from the Maplewood Housing and Economic Development Commission, which, remember, a while back, they used to meet every single month, because there should be enough work for this commission to be reviewing things every single month, whether or not that it's economic development, whether or not it's housing, whether or not it's public policy regarding either of those two types of issues. But no, the city council said we only want to hear what they have to say quarterly. So the HETC Commission only meets quarterly, and as a result, they really don't have much input on anything, and they're only just given basically a summary of what has gone on since their last meeting. So here we are, our first clip, where they are going to approve their minutes from, wow, way back last July. And the reason we've included this clip because it really does demonstrate the space of time since their last meeting to now. And if you've been watching these programs, you know that there's been a lot of housing issues, a lot of development issues, a lot of discussion about the North End Working Group that have gone on since July to mid-October. Let's take a look.
Questions, changes, observations on the minutes from our meeting of July 18th? Seeing none, I'll look for a motion to approve the minutes as presented.
Commissioner Finley makes a motion to approve the minutes as presented.
The commission has basically become just an opportunity to sit down and get summaries of what has occurred. They're not a policy-making committee anymore, and as you can see, they barely had a quorum to this meeting in October. What's the point of going to a meeting if you're not really going to have any impact on the decisions and the recommendations that are going to the council for the development of the community?
Can I ask you a question, Diane? For a quorum, how many members are supposed to be on there, technically?
I believe that they have 7 members, so they needed to have four members in attendance, which they had.
So, bringing back to the issue that's July, and this is 3 months later, they haven't had any meetings within the 2-month period.
3 months.
3 months period. My question is, why couldn't the other 3 show up? And if they didn't show up, shouldn't they put a resignation in? Because this is supposed to be their responsibility at this point. Is it maybe because they have decided they are inconsequential at this point and they've made that? I'd really like to have come on our show and tell us why they couldn't make one meeting in a 3-month period.
Right. Well, and it goes to that point of this is a great way to disincentivize volunteers who want to serve on a committee, that they signed up for a commitment of participating, of reviewing policy, of making recommendations, and then you tell them, oh, by the way, you know, I know you guys met every month, we were bringing stuff to you every month, but we've decided that we only need to hear from you quarterly. I mean, how demotivating can that be to somebody?
Right.
So now next in our next clip, we're going to hear from the new community development staff person that was hired in Maplewood back before July, and we've never really heard where he came from or his background. So I'm including this because I think we'll all find this interesting to know what his background is in community development, something certainly Maplewood is in dire need of.
Meeting leading us
It is.
as our staff liaison. So, Jeff, if you want to take just a little second before you jump into A, just tell us and the viewership a little bit about you.
Sure, to the 2 people.
Yeah, the 2 who are watching live.
Yeah, thank you, Chair and Commissioners. So yeah, my name is Jeff Thompson. I apologize, I started in May, so beginning of May is when I started as the Community Development Director here in Maplewood. I apologize, I wasn't at your July meeting. It was just before I started, a pre-planned vacation, so I was disappointed I couldn't make it, but I'm happy to be here tonight. A bit of background, been in the community development field and economic development field for 12 years. Prior to coming to Maplewood, I was in Wayzata as their planning and building director for about 3.5 years. Smaller town, about 4,500 people, but very active in development. So got a broad range of experience there in all sorts of different types of community economic development projects. Before that, I was in Minnetonka, the city of Minnetonka, for about 10 years, doing, again, the same work in community and economic development. So happy to be here in Maplewood and the exciting things that are happening here, and certainly to be a resource to you as a commission, but also to the community and including the business and residents of the community to a lot of the great plans and visions that have been put forward recently.
He comes to Maplewood with a different point of view from having worked in Wayzata and Minnetonka. So I hope that some of his experience in those two communities can translate to Maplewood, and that Maplewood might grow to have a bigger and better vision for our community, like Minnetonka and Wayzata has for their community.
I'm a factory worker before I retired, and I have never had a place where I'm hired new that allows me to take a vacation. At the beginning, I'm supposed to have at least a year. My son is working at a place where it was 2 years before he got his first vacation. And I find it astounding that this is supposed to be him digging in, and it's this is a responsible, either he got better pay here or this is a better job. Either way, if it's that valuable, you think he would want to show up and say, okay, I can forego vacation. Yes, the family needs it, but I know when I had to change jobs, I foregone a lot of vacation, especially when I changed jobs 3 or 4 times during my lifetime.
Right. Well, it goes to, though, the point, Mr. Bradley, that there are different benefits between those who work in government at these levels, such as the higher levels in Maplewood, and those of us who are working day to day, slugging it out in the fields.
But I wonder if he's getting paid for that time that he was on vacation, but from the Maplewood group. And what is his? This is a new department, isn't it? And as
well, that's a good question, Mr. Bradley. I believe they've done some restructuring because Maplewood always had something that was sort of like the community development or something to that effect, and then it was merged together with another department, and now I think it's been separated apart again. So I think that they've done some reorganization. They haven't made a big deal about the reorganization that they have done. But it's good to question that. Now, in this process of his giving his presentation, he's giving the commission members an update on the rental licensure ordinance that was passed. Let's take a look.
On the council's adoption of the rental housing licensing program. The short summary of that is they did adopt in September the ordinance establishing a new rental housing licensing requirement and program in Maplewood starting next year in 2020. The goal, and I know that ordinance has been reviewed at your commission before the council's adoption, and you were involved in that.
It's interesting that he notes that this issue was brought before this commission way back near the beginning of the year to find out what their input was. Their input was that they weren't so keen on it. They were not really very supportive of having a rental license ordinance in Maplewood. Part of the reason was they could see unintended consequences of it, that it would have an impact on snowbirds, and that there was this other additional departmental inspections and stuff that would have to go on, and they were not supportive. Well, then they brought it back to them again the next quarter and convinced them to give a recommendation that they were supportive of it. So it's sort of an understatement to say that they were involved in it, in that their first recommendation was that they didn't support it. Then their second recommendation was that they did support it, after they saw that the council was pushing for it. And so here we are. Now he's giving them a final report on the conclusion. So let's take a look at our next clip.
So you know that there are really three primary goals associated with the rental licensing program. One, to provide kind of clean, safe, and good housing for renters in the community. The second is to provide safe and secure housing from a crime prevention standpoint. And then probably the third goal is kind of overall neighborhood stability throughout the community, recognizing that a lot of our rental properties are integrated into existing neighborhoods.
Those goals, of course, all sound well and good. And certainly we don't dispute that those are good aspirational goals. They're good for a community, they're good for families, but they never do talk about how those goals are not being met today without the ordinance, or even what the scope of the problem is. They have never disclosed that, and as we discussed on our previous report, even at the meeting when they passed the ordinance, they still had no statistics to justify this enactment of an ordinance that creates another layer of governmental activities in the rental property area. Now, it might be one thing if you have a substantial number of properties in your community that are rental. Let's say 30%, even 20%. That would be a substantial number. In Maplewood, we have a population of about 40,000 people. They average somewhere around 1.8 to 2.3 people per housing unit. So if you do the math, it gives you an idea of approximately how many housing units there are in Maplewood. This particular ordinance applies to only 600 properties. 600 properties. Let's continue as he moves forward with his presentation in front of the commission.
The ordinance that establishes kind of the framework for the program, but one of the key components of the program that's certainly common to rental licensing programs is a city inspection program. So as part of the licensing, the city will be inspecting all of the rental dwelling units in the community on a cycle, on a schedule that we will establish. And largely the focus of that is to ensure that those units are just abiding by our city codes.
Okay, so this is now the crux of what the whole rental ordinance is about. It's about inspection. So they have to hire people to do these inspections. They have to monitor inspections. They have to do re-inspections. You see, they've just decided how they can grow their city government one more time.
How many units did you say initially it really covers?
It covers 600 properties.
So that means if...
And some of those properties, keep in mind, are multifamily, so
Right.
they might have, 10 to, 150 units, depending upon how big the apartment complex is. But still, we're talking only about 600 properties.
Which means if he was to do the inspection himself, doing the numerics on it sounds like he would have to only do 2 a day if he was doing it.
Well, now our next clip is actually not from the HEDC meeting that we've got clips from, but it's actually from a previous city council meeting back in July, where the finance director outlines exactly what it's going to take to do all these inspections. So we're going to answer your question, Mr. Bradley. How many inspections, how many people? Let's take a look.
The difference is we held off on the police officer, the rental housing officer. It's in there for 1/10 of a year. So kind of the same thing that we did last year by starting officers in the mid-year. This would allow a police officer to start at the end of 2020. And then we would figure out a way to roll it into, assuming that the fees will cover it, to roll it into next year's budget. We also took out some of the administrative expenses. It was determined that Probably the entire part of the administration could be handled in community development, and in that way, we would not have to increase the fire admin. So that is how we saved that amount of money. And again, the caveat is that $40,000 or possibly more is actually filling other holes in the general fund. So we'd be really concerned about, we wouldn't be asking for 5 if we didn't think it was absolutely necessary, and some of these reasons are why.
This is the finance director justifying why the city council has to raise next year's property tax levy by 5%, because they're going to have this new add-on of this department. Now, we're going to bring that slide back up so that I can go through some of the numbers with you, because there's two sets of numbers that we had on the screen. One is what it will cost if they have their employees for the whole entire year. The other one is how they were going to try to juggle around some things so they could make it fit into the budget for 2020. And so that's what the comparison is. And so when we look at these numbers, we see what it costs for this rental housing inspection program. It will cost annually $353,000 a year. That is what it will cost. And of course, what they have budgeted is less, because as you heard, they're going to not hire some people until near the end of the year, but that still means that they have to come up with that budget for the next year, 2021.
Notice
Now,
something?
if we bring this back up again, we see that it says a fire inspector. Now, you might think, oh, this fire inspector, is that going to be new and additional to the fire inspector we currently have? The answer, from my understanding and talking to people in the know, is that the answer is no. That currently Maplewood does not have a fire inspector. They don't have a fire marshal. And that when Butch Jarvis retired a couple years back, that they never filled that position again. So you see, this program is actually being implemented to put new additional people on staff that the city doesn't currently have. It's just another funding mechanism in order to pay for staff salaries, in some cases staff positions that have been open and have remained open because the city can't afford to fill them. So now let's continue as we go back to our next clip, which is from the Housing and Economic Development Commission just this October 2019.
Primary focuses of that are going to be the fire code, ensuring that the fire prevention standards are being met. And second is just around property maintenance, that they are complying with the city's property maintenance code. And today we actually do have a property maintenance code. And what's unique to Maplewood is that we actually have our own code. So a lot of times communities will adopt kind of existing property maintenance codes, but I don't know the exact data, I don't have all the great historical knowledge yet. But we for some time have had our kind of own independently written maintenance code that is unique because it is our own, but also it's unique because it distinguishes between rental units and owner-occupied units and actually provides different standards.
We covered this about a year ago when then environmental specialist Chris Swanson, who was working for the city, was up before the city council with Melinda Coleman, the city manager, talking about this whole program about rental property inspections, and he let it slip out of the bag that they had different standards for rental property maintenance versus single-family home family maintenance. And our questions that have been on this program is, how can you have two different standards when both of the properties are residential properties? What would be the justification for that? Now, I raised that question to appointed Mayor Marley Abrams when I had an interview with her back last February. And she was aghast that I would suggest that somehow or other that the standards for rental property and owner-occupied property would be different. And yet, now we have it confirmed here in October that indeed Maplewood has been under different standards. I can imagine what kind of legal consequences that would have if it were challenged in court.
I was going to also mention that the one thing that I noticed on the new planned budget, $75,000 was taken out in police training. And with all the suits that have gone across the whole Twin Cities area on officers that have done things, and city's responsibility is supposed to be make sure that the police are trained, what is the liability if there is no funding for new training for our officers?
Right. Well, and considering that this is a situation where we're talking about rental properties and whether or not, what is the role of that police officer in this rental licensure program? We don't really know. They haven't really said. But certainly they can't just go knocking on people's doors and saying, I'm going to go in there and do an inspection now. That's not what they can do. So let's continue with our next clip.
Code we are familiar with because our building inspectors and our code enforcement staff enforce that across the board on all those properties. And we've had certainly some challenges with it. It's not the most clear, concise, kind of easy to enforce. And so the city has been looking at kind of rescinding those existing regulations and adopting a more known standard, which is the International Property Maintenance Code. It's a code that is developed by the International Code Council. And they are the same body that kind of adopts both the building codes that people are familiar with in construction, as well as the fire codes.
So I do see this as a good move, that they're going to go towards a more standardized model that is consistent with other communities. And this particular code applies to both rental and single-family owner, or rather owner-occupied residential. So that's the distinction between rental, residential, and owner-occupied residential. But as we'll hear in a future clip, it also applies to commercial properties. Let's continue.
Annual conventions to kind of bring all practitioners and professionals in the field to the table to kind of review the code, see what's working, what's not working, and provide updates to it. So it has a real comprehensive approach to it, has a good institution of kind of tweaking it and updating it, and is also one of the benefits to the community is it provides, other communities use it. So when I was in Wayzata, we had adopted the International Property Maintenance Code. So for rental property owners that own properties in other communities, it's something that they could be more familiar with, and provide some consistency of regulation across the city. And then just from an administration standpoint, because it's written by code professionals and updated regularly, if we need to take enforcement action or to enforce the code, it becomes a lot easier to do that. And certainly as we progress along enforcement, it's a much better tool for the city to use.
Now, I had a case where I represented a Maplewood resident, and the issue had to do with the additional parking area that they added on to their driveway. And what we found in that case is that Maplewood had a particular ordinance or code having to do with what was required for impervious spaces and how to go about adding on parking space or extra driveways, and that there was a procedure you had to go through if you had plans to increase your space beyond 50%. But then there was ambiguity into it, and the city official that we had on the stand then was relying upon not just the ordinance and the code, but upon public policy that they had typed up and on their website. And you see, whether or not something's just typed up and on the website is totally different than if it's a codified ordinance. And in the end, it was clear that some of the policies that they were using were not part of their ordinance at all and are not enforceable, because policies are not enforceable, whereas an ordinance is. So I can see where they've probably run into some ambiguity questions and issues with their property maintenance code that they have currently on the books. And so it probably is a good thing to get it cleaned up. So let's continue.
I think it's great to be consistent with other cities. I think that standardization carries a lot of convenience for the property owners, to lessen the burden on them. So I do like that. I also like the fact that when it's in, if the city gets sued over an issue, this is something that's recognized international, not just U.S. And so these issues have been thought through and probably discussed in legal terms multiple times. So it protects the city a little bit more. So I like it.
Absolutely. It does protect the city a little bit more. And I'm glad that this community development director has had exposure to this international property maintenance code, and that the city that he came from, Wayzata, adopted it. But you don't just simply say, yes, we're just going to take it as the complete model, enact it, and say it fits our community. There are things that have to be done to tweak it a little bit so that it fits your community, because after all, it is only a model code, which means that it's a great framework, and that is expected that there are provisions within it that you will modify to meet your community's needs. Let's continue.
I just have a few questions, but one, administratively, this is updated regularly, is it annually, and what would be the process of, would then the city look at those updates on an annual basis?
Yeah, Chair and Commission, correct. They are, so I think I put the 2018 code in your packet. This is actually kind of the second version of the 2018 code, so I think they make more minor tweaks on an annual basis to the overall code, and then I don't think there's a regular pattern, but every so many years they actually kind of recodify and kind of do a more comprehensive review of it and update it. Yeah.
And so typically what happens is that the city puts together an ordinance that references this particular model code. And then within it, that ordinance, then they would specify how it is modified or changed to meet the community's needs.
I would say if we adopt the 2018 code, those kind of minor tweaks that happen on an annual basis, we wouldn't have to re-adopt. But when there's kind of the recodification of the larger code, we would then need to amend our ordinance to review it and make sure that's still consistent with our objectives, and then adopt that new code. It's the same process we would follow for the building code.
And is the intent at this point to adopt it in its entirety?
The commissioners asked a good question. Is the intent to adopt it in its entirety? Now, his question, Mr. Bradley, leads me to believe that in their packet of information, that question hasn't been thought out yet by staff as to what portions of the model code are going to be adapted to Maplewood's particular needs. Otherwise, why would the commissioner have asked that question?
Right.
That's right. So let's continue and see what the answer is.
And then I think just my final question is, it talks about the benefits of this. Are there any, I guess, detriment, anything that is of concern of adopting this, in your opinion?
Chair and Commissioners, no, not as we've reviewed it. We haven't seen any concerns in the actual regulations of something that would be a concern to us. We did look at the, there is an appendix in here, so we can adopt the code, and in the building code, there are many appendix, but here there's only one. We looking at it, it looks like it's largely non-applicable. It's about kind of boarding of windows along the ground floor, so we probably won't look to adopt that appendix. So that's the only thing we saw in there that probably is not applicable to Maplewood.
So the answer is, the only thing that's really not applicable is the appendix.
You know, what bothers me about it is I'm listening to this whole thing, and if it is adequate for everything, you think he'd say yes. If you're going to accept something, you really should have the things that at least should be looked at for review.
Well, and another direction that the city could go is that in their ordinance, they could say that this will be reviewed annually
Right.
or every 2 years to update according to our community's needs. And so certainly this staff person could have suggested that that is an addition that could be made to the ordinance. I don't know that the commissioners have the background to think that that's actually something the ordinance could
Right.
say, but certainly this staff person has that background and could have suggested that to see what the commissioner's viewpoint on adding that kind of language would be as a way to solicit recommendations from the commission members. Because as you can see from this meeting, he has given his presentation. The commissioners have some questions, but in the end, they're not really asked for recommendations on how to tweak anything. They're simply asked if they can support a recommendation that the city adopt this.
Right.
That's it.
And that's what bothers me about, because he's come from 2 other cities. He should know that that one wasn't probably done exactly the same. I think that's what they should have asked him. What did the other cities do to change
Yes,
that issue?
that's an excellent question, Mr. Bradley. Excellent question. Now, in my viewing of this initially, I thought to myself, well, what is the difference between Maplewood's existing property management code for rental properties, for owner-occupied properties, and how does it compare to this model code? That they could have a comparative analysis there for the commissioners. Well, they didn't have that. But let's continue with our next clip.
I just had a similar question too, since it's a model, international model, it does get adopted in full without any, does anybody go through and make tweaks to it, changes? I would think with something, if it's international, there's going to be a lot of items that are not going to be applicable to our climate, our demographics, our...
Chair and Commission, we've actually gone through it and haven't identified anything that we think we need to not adopt as part of the code, because it references the things that are more climate specific are really in the energy code, and it really adopts that by reference. And so we've adopted the energy code as part of our other existing codes. So any tweaks that are in our ordinance today that relate to a more specific climate would kind of carry through, since this doesn't specifically reference the energy code.
So his answer basically is, we've looked through all that for you, just trust us. Boy, that's the best answer that the staff person can always give when they don't have an answer. We've done it, we've looked at it, just trust us. Let's continue.
We haven't seen anything in these existing regulations that would kind of see that we would want to not adopt those particular sections, which we could, but we haven't identified what they are. But certainly if there are things you see in there that maybe we should look at, we'd certainly be willing to do that.
On that subject, I'm going to jump to you. There are a number of sections, though, where the code actually says jurisdiction, I don't know, basically the jurisdiction sets the number. The height of weeds, stuff like that.
Yeah.
I'm assuming staff has gone through or will go through and select what their values are for any of those items in that regard. So there is some change to how we read it here today.
Sure, correct. Correct. We would certainly do that and look to the existing code for consistency and what we've enforced, or use kind of what we've seen in the field as we've been dealing with any sort of property maintenance issues.
Commissioner Mark Jenkins, he went through it and reviewed it himself, and that's how he identified that there are some fill-in-the-blank sections of this model code. Now, the staff person did not tell them that in advance. He just expected that they figured that out by reviewing the materials provided. This would have been another excellent opportunity to engage the commissioners in getting feedback for the city council when they go through this process as well. In that the staff person could have had a listing of all the fill-in-the-blank areas that are in the model code and say in, for example, long grass, that in Maplewood the current ordinance is 8 inches, and I think that's what it is, that is 8 inches, and then ask the commissioners, okay, that's what it currently is for Maplewood, what is your feeling on that? I mean, do you support that we continue with 8 inches? Because this is an opportunity to look at what those maintenance standards are for Maplewood, and do we still agree with the standards that were set a long time ago? We may find that we want to change those standards. Maybe everybody agrees that 8 inches for your grass height is still appropriate. Some people might think it should be longer. Some people might think it should be shorter. Some people might say, well, it could be longer if they're native grasses because somebody has turned their yard into a native grass planting. So you see, there are areas here that discussion could have been had from the volunteers on the commission that get their recommendations, but nothing was elicited from them. Let's continue.
We had a city customized code. We're adopting now the international code. That means they're not exactly the same. And so my question's around that issue of the differences between the two. I did not pull up the existing and go through line by line to cross-reference, but I mean, is there concern of confusion this may create that current property owner, renter that's been doing this for some time and now we're switching? Do they need to be concerned that we're switching up the rules on them? I mean, is there anything that stands out that does the city need to do any extra communication on this because of some significant change, do you feel?
This commissioner was thinking along the same tracks I was. What's the difference between what we currently have and what the model code says? That would be important to know. And then the second part of that question is, how are we going to make sure that everybody in the community knows that there's going to be changes to the maintenance code? And it doesn't impact just rental properties, it impacts owner-occupied properties as well. And that is really the crux of the impact of this change in Maplewood, is that it's going to have the greatest impact on all the properties that are owner-occupied, which is substantially more than a majority of the properties in Maplewood. That is who this is going to affect. Let's continue.
Yeah, good question. Chair and Commissioners, I would say a couple things. One, I think we will look at, of course, as we wrap up our take it to the council, we'll certainly go through it again and make sure that there's nothing conflicting between what we have been doing and what this says. I would say I'm not terribly concerned that there's a lot of concern about switching the regulations midstream, just because our enforcement has been so limited, because it's been on a complaint basis, and we haven't been doing proactive inspections of housing units of rental or owner-occupied. So it's not like there's a lot of people are familiar with what our regulations are. It'd be only those that we've gone through an enforcement process with. But fair enough that we would want to communicate out to people that this is the direction we're going in terms of our code.
So he leads people to believe that it's not going to be an issue because they only do their inspections based on a complaint process. However, we know that that is not the plan. We have reported on these programs when they presented to the council, and the council accepted and supported a resolution for neighborhood sweeps, where the inspectors go out into a neighborhood and they don't go into your house, but they look at your property as much as they can from their vantage point and will write out the warnings and do a re-inspection and write out the citations. And we've also reported on these programs how the communications department, how they're going to be purchasing drones, and how the people in the communications department are going to go and get drone training, and that we have supposed on these programs that the drone and the drone training capacity is not just going to be used for that occasional drone shot from the sky for their little film footage that they're doing on some little communications briefing that they put on their YouTube, but that they're actually going to expand that drone usage into doing flyovers over the neighborhoods that they're going to be doing their neighborhood sweeps of. So now you can see the expansion of this whole program also goes into and impacts potentially those people who are owner-occupied properties minding their own business, because there's going to be neighborhood sweeps, possible drone usage of looking at your property from the sky, and they'll have this new code that they can rely upon that they know will hold up in court. Mr. Bradley, your thoughts?
Well, I've got a couple of thoughts here. First of all, I'd like to ask, since he has been in a couple other cities before this, if it's had any changes at all, I think that should have been something he pointed out. I also am thinking to myself, geez, it makes the city a peeping Tom. Think of the drones going into your backyard.
That's another issue, Mr. Bradley, I hadn't thought of, but the invasion of privacy of what you might be doing in your own backyard where you expect privacy. And I was looking at it only from the perspective of looking at what you have with regard to non-code compliant issues in your backyard. Something to think about. Well, let's continue with our next clip.
And alongside that, because the international code is much more inclusive, there actually are a number of items in the international code that weren't addressed in the city code. So my questions were similar to Commissioner Finley's in that, and I'll take the one example I looked up. If you park a vehicle that's inoperable in your backyard in Maplewood, there's no code to say whether or not you need to yank it or you have so much time to remove it, but the international code does. Mm-hmm. Are we looking at, to Mr. Finley's point, are we looking at some communication to say, hey, heads up, as of January 1, July 1, whatever the initiation date is, these codes are going into effect, and if so, can we build in some amount of time to say, okay, we're going to notify you January 1st that it goes into effect July, or?
A commissioner who's been on this commission for a very long time brings up exactly that issue, is that the Maplewood Property Maintenance Code is different from what the model code is, and how are you going to let people know that? Because somebody may think, okay, I have this old car, I'm going to be doing a restoration of it, I'm going to fix it up, whatever, I have it in the back, out of sight, but nonetheless it is in the backyard, and Now they would be required that they would not be allowed to have it there. The Maplewood Code does require that any vehicle on your property is got current tabs on it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's operable, because you could keep your tabs current and it not be operable.
Right.
But Mr. Jenkins brings up a good example, and that, as I indicated, this implementation of this code is going to most greatly affect those folks who are owner-occupied properties, which are the majority, the greater majority of all of the residential properties in Maplewood. Now we have time for one last clip. Let's take a look.
Those specific details yet about how we communicate it once it gets adopted? Because if you look at the larger rental ordinance, there's a lot of communication we need to do to get the word out that the license is going to be required and what that entails. So we've, it's in our mind, what that communication will look like, but until we get more details about how the program will operate and how this code will impact the city, we can certainly be more strategic about how we address the communication piece.
And to the rental part of it, in the policy issue piece in our packet, it talks about well-maintained rental properties, but this code as written applies to owner-occupied as well as rental properties. So I think we need to be clear, we're talking about a code for all properties, not just rental properties in the city, correct?
Correct.
Mr. Jenkins clarified and confirmed that this model code applies not just to rental properties, but to owner-occupied residential properties as well. And later in the meeting, it was confirmed it applies to commercial properties as well. But commercial properties also have additional considerations in the property management of commercial properties, because there's also zoning requirements with regard to commercial. Well, Mr. Bradley, we've come to the end of our program. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I would like to ask one last question. If they do make a decision to go after somebody, is there an appeals portion to that?
And that's a good point, bringing up the question of appeal if indeed you've received a citation under this code. Who do you appeal to? Is it administrative? Do you go before the city council? And there is always then that concern about, will you have a fair shake in front of the city council?
Right.
Well, thank you, viewers, for tuning in this week. We'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.
I support it, but I support it with a huge caveat I didn't read it cover to cover. I can sleep on a plane without reading this, but hey, maybe I'll take it along next time. But I didn't read it cover to cover, but there were some things I looked for that I knew we had gaps in, and this certainly is much more complete. I would ask the city to seriously consider some type of a communication tool. Certainly with the rental housing, you'll have plenty of communications that this can dovetail onto pretty easily. But for owner-occupied homes, are we going to use this for our business properties as well? Because this can apply to those, but I think we have separate maintenance codes for businesses.
Correct. So yeah, this is, there's more comprehensive zoning regulations around kind of business operations pieces. But certainly some of the general provisions around long grass and more nuisance-related issues, would apply to businesses as well.
Okay. So yeah, I'd just ask that the city, keep serious consideration on how do we notify residents and businesses, and what kind of a lead time are we going to give them? At this time of year, we may seriously think about saying, by the time we put this together and communicate it, some of these things legitimately may not be amendable until the spring.
This is kind of one of our building inspection staff have, they're familiar with it. They actually reference it. They've actually had copies in their office that they reference just to kind of provide direction on our property maintenance standards. That doesn't mean we enforce it if it's not consistent with our code. So they've been relying on it. So they're somewhat familiar with it. They've reviewed it. We wanted to bring it to this commission first to get any feedback. And I expect our goal would be to get it adopted by the council by the end of the year, so that it's effective in the time that we roll out the licensing program in 2020.